The emergency shutdown countdown had already reached 90 seconds when every screen inside Caldwell Freight Systems turned the same unsettling shade of amber. No alarms screamed anymore. That was the frightening part. The building had gone so quiet that the soft clicking of the countdown clock sounded louder than the voices of 24 executives who had run out of answers. Naomi Caldwell stood at the head of the operations floor with a digital authorization tablet resting against her palm. One signature would disconnect the automated network that moved food, medicine, and emergency supplies across 12 states. It would also erase 30 years of everything her father had built before she expanded it into one of the largest logistics companies in America. Around her, engineers stared helplessly at lines of frozen data. Consultants whispered about catastrophic software corruption. Someone suggested a cyber attack. Another insisted the artificial intelligence had entered an unrecoverable fault state. Every explanation sounded convincing. None of them restarted a single conveyor. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the authorization screen. "If I don't sign," she said quietly, "every minute costs another $200,000. If I do sign, thousands of deliveries won't arrive by morning." No one answered. Even the experts avoided looking at her. Near the rear maintenance corridor, a man wearing a faded work jacket silently finished tightening the lid on a steel toolbox. He wiped a thin streak of grease from his fingers with a folded shop towel before noticing a frightened young intern struggling to carry a heavy battery pack across the polished floor. Without saying a word, he walked over, lifted the awkward load as though it weighed almost nothing, carried it to her workstation, nodded politely when she thanked him, and turned to leave. Nobody knew his name. Nobody cared. To everyone on the operations floor, he was simply another contract maintenance technician whose shift had ended an hour earlier. Security had already begun escorting outside contractors toward the exit. "Sir, this area is restricted now," one officer said firmly. The man stopped. Immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply glanced once across the massive control wall before taking another step toward the elevator. Then something caught his attention. It wasn't one of the frozen maps. It wasn't the flashing warning banners. It was a tiny amber indicator hidden beneath the corner of an auxiliary control cabinet, blinking with a rhythm so subtle it looked almost accidental. He frowned, not dramatically, just enough for someone paying close attention to notice. His eyes remained fixed on that single light while everyone else stared at the giant screens above it. The security officer gestured again. "Sir, we really need you to leave." The man looked away from the cabinet and offered a respectful smile. "Of course," he replied, his calm voice carrying none of the panic filling the room. He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the elevator. Naomi finally raised the stylus to approve the shutdown. Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Across the room, the elevator doors began sliding closed. Just before they met, the maintenance technician quietly turned back and spoke 7 words that nobody expected to hear. "Please, don't shut it down for 60 seconds. 60 seconds earlier that morning, Derek Holloway had been standing in a tiny kitchen where the paint above the window had begun to peel from years of winter moisture. A pot of oatmeal simmered quietly while his 8-year-old son, Caleb, sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by the scattered gears of an old railroad pocket watch they had rescued from a neighborhood flea market for $3. Caleb held up one brass gear between 2 careful fingers and frowned. "This one looks exactly like the others," he said. Derek smiled without looking away from the lunch he was packing. "Nothing that matters is ever exactly like the others." Caleb tilted his head. "How can you tell?" Derek finally walked over, crouched beside him, and pointed to a tiny groove barely visible along one edge. "Because somebody made this one to carry more weight than people think." Caleb studied it again before grinning with quiet satisfaction. "You always notice the tiny stuff." Derek simply shrugged. "You notice it too. You just do not trust your eyes yet." They left the apartment 20 minutes later beneath a gray sky, threatening rain. Caleb insisted on carrying his own backpack even though one strap had begun to tear. Derek offered to replace it, but Caleb refused. "It still works." Derek nodded with approval. They stopped at a crosswalk where an elderly crossing guard struggled to keep a bent warning sign from falling into traffic. Before the light changed, Derek stepped forward, straightened the loose bracket with nothing more than a pocket screwdriver from his keychain, and quietly returned before anyone realized what he had done. The crossing guard thanked him. Derek only wished her a good morning and continued walking. By 8:30, Caleb disappeared through the front doors of Lincoln Elementary, turning back only once to wave. Derek waited until his son was safely inside before heading toward Caldwell Freight Systems on the opposite side of the city. His contract that week was ordinary enough. Inspect a series of aging electrical cabinets scheduled for replacement over the next quarter. Nothing urgent, nothing glamorous. He signed in through the contractor entrance where most employees passed without making eye contact. The receptionist accidentally printed the wrong visitor badge with someone else's last name. Derek noticed the mistake immediately but smiled and wore it anyway rather than delay the growing line behind him. Inside the maintenance corridor, he worked methodically, tightening loose terminals, replacing worn insulation, and writing unusually detailed notes that most technicians would have ignored because the repairs were months away from becoming official problems. One cabinet drew his attention longer than the others. Near its base, almost hidden behind bundled cables, someone had scratched a tiny pencil mark shaped like an arrow beside a serial number. It looked insignificant. It should not have been there. Derek touched the faded mark with one fingertip, then glanced toward a nearby auxiliary panel where a faint amber light blinked once before going dark again. Not broken, not random, familiar. Somehow, before he could examine it further, his supervisor called over the radio asking every contractor to report to another section of the building because the operations team had detected unusual network instability. Derek took one last look at the strange pencil mark, closed the cabinet without a word, and walked away, unaware that less than 2 hours later the entire company would be convinced the disaster had begun somewhere else. The moment Derek stepped away from the cabinet, the first conveyor line stopped without warning. Then another. Within 30 seconds, an entire row of automated sorting arms froze in place, trapping dozens of outgoing medical shipments that had to reach hospitals before sunrise the next day. Maintenance radios erupted with overlapping voices. Engineers hurried past carrying diagnostic tablets, while supervisors ordered every contractor to clear the operations floor immediately. Derek could have walked out with everyone else. His shift was technically over, and staying would almost certainly mean hours of unpaid time he could not afford. Caleb would be waiting for him after school, and he had promised they would finish rebuilding the old pocket watch together before dinner. He tightened his grip on his worn toolbox, glanced toward the exit, then quietly turned around instead. If there was even a small chance that one loose connection could keep thousands of deliveries moving, he could not simply pretend he had seen nothing. A young technician nearly collided with him while rushing toward another electrical room, dropping a stack of printed wiring diagrams across the floor. Without hesitation, Derek knelt, gathered every page into the correct numerical order before handing them back, noticing that 2 diagrams described completely different circuits despite sharing the same revision date. The technician barely thanked him before sprinting away, never realizing Derek had quietly prevented another mistake. From an elevated glass office overlooking the operations floor, Naomi Caldwell watched the exchange while listening to 3 senior consultants argue over conflicting software reports. She frowned for a moment. Most contractors hurried toward the parking lot when overtime was uncertain. This one seemed more interested in fixing other people's problems than protecting his own schedule. It was unusual, but unusual did not necessarily mean trustworthy. She turned her attention back to the growing crisis. Derek continued walking toward the auxiliary control section where the faint amber indicator had caught his eye earlier. Before he reached it, Security Director Oscar Bennett stepped into the corridor. "Contractors are finished for the day," he said politely but firmly. "The executive team needs this area cleared." Derek nodded immediately. Understood. He did not argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket, removed the temporary visitor badge with the incorrect last name still printed across the front, and handed it over. Oscar glanced at the badge, then at Derek's work order. "You never reported the printing mistake." Derek smiled faintly. "The line behind me was long. It did not seem important." Oscar looked at him with mild surprise. Most people complained over smaller inconveniences. Before he could respond, Derek's eyes drifted once more toward the auxiliary cabinet. The amber light blinked again. 3 short flashes, a pause, then one longer pulse. Something about the sequence settled uncomfortably in the back of his mind. It reminded him less of an electrical failure than of a machine desperately trying to communicate under the wrong conditions. He almost spoke, then stopped himself. Guessing inside a billion-dollar operation without proof could make everything worse. Across the room, Naomi noticed him hesitating near the cabinet and assumed he was simply curious like everyone else. Still, she found herself wondering why his attention remained fixed on the smallest panel in the building while every certified specialist focused on the massive central servers. Before she could dismiss the thought, one of the senior engineers suddenly shouted that the emergency diagnostics had uncovered a handwritten maintenance notation buried inside the system archive. The note contained only 6 words and a faded employee identification number. Derek recognized both the handwriting and the number instantly, and the color quietly left his face. The maintenance notation was projected onto every executive screen before anyone had time to question where it had come from. The faded entry had been written almost 9 years earlier during the installation of the auxiliary control network. It warned that one backup sensor should never be calibrated by automated software because vibration from the freight floor could create a false stability reading during heavy operating loads. The recommendation had been marked for manual inspection every 5 years. The inspection date had passed 8 months earlier. An uncomfortable silence spread across the room before the chief engineer quickly insisted the note was obsolete because the company had upgraded its artificial intelligence diagnostics twice since then. Most of the executives accepted that explanation immediately. Derek did not. He recognized the handwriting because he had once worked beside the man who wrote it, a quiet field specialist who trusted physical evidence more than computer models. He also remembered something else. That engineer never wrote warnings unless he had already witnessed the exact failure himself. Before Derek could organize his thoughts, Oscar Bennett motioned firmly toward the exit again. Contractors were no longer permitted anywhere near the control systems because the company had officially declared an operational emergency. Derek understood the order and started walking away without protest, but every step toward the elevator felt heavier than the last. If he remained silent, the shutdown would almost certainly continue. If he spoke without proof, he could easily become the distraction everyone blamed for wasting precious time. Upstairs, Naomi listened as financial analysts calculated losses that climbed by the minute. Hospitals were calling for shipment updates. Grocery distribution centers wanted explanations. Local news stations had begun asking whether the outage might affect emergency supply routes before morning. Each new phone call carried consequences far beyond company profits. She glanced through the glass wall toward the departing contractors and briefly noticed Derek disappearing into the corridor with the same calm expression he had worn all day. Something about that composure felt strangely out of place inside a building filled with panic. Then another alert interrupted her thoughts. Engineers had isolated what appeared to be the primary fault inside the central software cluster and unanimously recommended a complete system reset. It sounded logical. It sounded safe. Yet the recommendation depended entirely on the assumption that the diagnostics themselves were trustworthy. At the far end of the corridor, Derek paused beside a maintenance cart after hearing a faint metallic vibration travel through the floor beneath his boots. It lasted barely 2 seconds before disappearing. The sound was almost identical to one he had heard years earlier under completely different circumstances. His eyes slowly lifted toward the ceiling, mentally tracing the hidden path of the auxiliary wiring that nobody else seemed to consider important. If that vibration reached the backup sensor at exactly the wrong frequency, every automated reading could become perfectly consistent and completely wrong at the same time. He reached into his toolbox, searching for an old inspection mirror that would let him confirm the suspicion from outside the restricted area, but the compartment where he always kept it was empty. Caleb had borrowed it the previous weekend while repairing the pocket watch, and Derek had forgotten to put it back. At that exact moment, Naomi received a secure call from the board of directors. They had reached a unanimous decision. She was instructed to authorize the irreversible shutdown immediately, and the digital signature request appeared on her tablet with a flashing deadline that could not be postponed. Naomi stared at the flashing authorization request while every instinct told her to sign before the board lost confidence in her leadership, yet something refused to settle in her mind. The handwritten warning, the overlooked inspection date, The contractor who had quietly paused beside the auxiliary cabinet instead of the failed servers. None of it fit the explanation her specialists continued repeating. She lowered the tablet without approving the shutdown. "I want one more verification," she said. The room erupted with objections. The chief engineer argued there was nothing left to verify because every diagnostic pointed to software failure. The financial officers warned that every additional minute increased the company's exposure. Even the board called again, demanding an immediate answer. Naomi asked only one question. "Has anyone physically inspected the backup sensor mentioned in that maintenance note?" Silence answered her. No one had. The artificial intelligence had reported it healthy, so no human being had bothered to check it. At the security station, Oscar finished collecting visitor badges when he noticed Derek still waiting near the lobby instead of driving away. "You are still here?" Oscar asked. Derek looked toward the operations tower through the glass entrance. "Someone is making a decision they cannot take back." Oscar folded his arms. "If you know something, now is the time to say it." Derek hesitated. He could describe the vibration. He could explain the blinking sequence. But every conclusion depended on evidence he did not yet possess. Guessing could destroy whatever credibility remained. "I know enough to worry," he answered quietly. "Not enough to accuse the wrong problem." Oscar studied him for a long moment. That was not the answer of someone chasing attention. It sounded like someone afraid of being wrong because the cost would fall on other people. Upstairs, a junior records analyst searching archived maintenance files discovered another forgotten document attached to the same installation project. It contained a faded photograph of the auxiliary cabinet taken on the day it entered service. Naomi enlarged the image until the picture filled the conference display. There, barely visible in one corner, was the same small pencil arrow Derek had noticed earlier that morning. The marking had existed since the system was built. It was intentional, not accidental. Why would an experienced field engineer leave a hidden reference that never appeared in any official blueprint? Before anyone could answer, the analyst uncovered one more detail. The original installation team had included an outside troubleshooting specialist whose name had been removed from the final project summary after accepting a position with another federal contractor. The personnel record had partially corrupted over time, leaving only a first initial and one surviving payroll code. Derek closed his eyes for a brief moment. He remembered that code. It belonged to the quiet mentor who had once told him, "Machines rarely lie. People simply stop asking the right question." The memory struck harder than he expected because it explained why the blinking pattern had felt so familiar all day. It was never intended to identify a software fault. It was a field signal warning technicians to ignore the automated diagnosis and inspect the physical system first. Before Derek could decide whether to reveal what he knew, Naomi's assistant rushed into the lobby carrying a printed personnel file that had just been recovered from an offsite archive. She stopped directly in front of Derek, looked from the document to his face twice, and whispered, "How do you know the man whose signature is on this file?" Derek looked at the personnel file for only a second before gently pushing it back toward Naomi's assistant. He did not deny recognizing the signature, but neither did he volunteer an explanation. "That file belongs to someone who earned the right to be remembered correctly," he said quietly. "This is not about me." The assistant hesitated, then hurried upstairs with the document. Minutes later, Naomi placed the worn file beside the original maintenance note and noticed something every software expert had overlooked. The same handwritten arrow appeared in 3 separate inspection photographs taken years apart, always pointing toward the auxiliary vibration sensor and never toward the central control system. The mark had never been intended for executives. It was a message between field technicians who understood that some failures could disguise themselves as successful diagnostics. Suddenly, the blinking amber light, the forgotten inspection interval, and the strange vibration beneath the floor no longer seemed like unrelated details. They formed a pattern. The chief engineer objected immediately, insisting that archived field habits could not outweigh live artificial intelligence analysis. Naomi did not argue. Instead, she asked a simple question that nobody in the room could answer. "Has anyone physically touched that sensor today?" Once again, silence filled the operations center. Downstairs, Oscar approached Derek with noticeably less suspicion than before. "If the board gives permission for one manual inspection, can you prove your concern?" Derek answered with complete honesty. I can prove nothing until I see the sensor with my own eyes. It was not the confident promise everyone wanted. It was the cautious answer of someone who respected consequences more than applause. Oscar studied him for another long moment before quietly handing back the temporary access badge that had been collected earlier. Do not make me regret this. Derek accepted it with a grateful nod and walked toward the restricted corridor without increasing his pace. Several engineers noticed the maintenance contractor returning and exchanged puzzled looks. Why would security allow him back inside during the largest operational crisis in company history? Naomi watched through the glass as Derek stopped beside the auxiliary cabinet instead of rushing toward the main servers like everyone else. He did not reach for expensive diagnostic equipment. He simply knelt, rested 2 fingertips against the steel housing, closed his eyes for several seconds, then slowly opened them again. The vibration is synchronized, he murmured almost to himself. It should not be. Nearby technicians frowned, unable to understand how anyone could learn something by touching painted metal. Derek then requested nothing more complicated than a flashlight and a basic inspection mirror. The request sounded almost absurd inside a billion-dollar control center equipped with advanced imaging systems. Yet when the mirror finally arrived, he angled it behind the tightly mounted sensor assembly where no fixed camera could see. A tiny fracture reflected back through the glass, so thin it looked almost invisible. Every automated diagnostic had reported the component healthy because electrically it still functioned. Mechanically, however, it shifted by a fraction of an inch whenever the freight floor vibrated under heavy load, sending perfectly believable but completely false stability readings throughout the network. Several engineers stared at the reflection in stunned silence as years of assumptions unraveled in seconds. Naomi felt hope return for the first time all day, but Derek's expression remained guarded. Finding the problem is not the same as fixing it, he said softly. If we interrupt the wrong circuit now, the entire backup network could lock permanently. Every eye in the room turned toward him as Naomi asked the question that would determine the fate of the company. If you had only one chance, which circuit would you disconnect first? Derek did not answer immediately. The silence that followed seemed to stretch longer than the countdown clock itself. Every engineer in the room expected an instant solution now that the damaged sensor had been found, but he understood that confidence without certainty could destroy the only remaining chance to save the network. He slowly studied the auxiliary cabinet one final time before pointing toward a narrow backup feeder mounted several feet below the fractured sensor. Not the damaged circuit, he said calmly. The one protecting it. The chief engineer immediately objected, insisting that disconnecting the backup feeder would violate every automated recovery protocol the company had established. Several executives nodded in agreement, relieved to hear a familiar explanation again. Naomi looked from the computer models to the tiny fracture reflected in Derek's inspection mirror. For the first time that day, the expensive software and the physical evidence were telling completely different stories. She knew whichever path she chose would become part of the company's history. Oscar quietly stepped beside the control panel and asked only one question. If this fails, what happens? Derek answered without hesitation. The shutdown becomes unavoidable. And if we do nothing? Oscar asked. Derek met his eyes. The same outcome. We only lose more time. The room fell silent once more. Naomi finally placed the authorization tablet face down on the console instead of signing the permanent shutdown order. Proceed, she said. The chief engineer protested again, warning that no contractor should be allowed to override certified recovery procedures. Naomi interrupted him before he could finish. He is not overriding the evidence. He is following it. Derek accepted the responsibility without a trace of triumph. He removed the protective panel with careful, practiced movements, pausing twice to feel the faint vibration traveling through the metal frame. Those watching expected dramatic gestures. Instead, every movement was patient, deliberate, almost ordinary. He asked an assistant to confirm the freight floor had temporarily stopped receiving new loading commands. He requested another technician verify voltage independently rather than trusting the display. He even stopped halfway through the procedure after noticing one loose fastener that could have shifted during the disconnect. Each delay increased the tension inside the room. Yet every pause revealed another layer of discipline that the executives had never associated with the quiet maintenance contractor. Then Derek carefully isolated the backup feeder. Nothing happened. For 3 endless seconds, every monitor remained frozen, and several people lowered their heads in disappointment. The chief engineer quietly whispered that the opportunity had been wasted. Before anyone could restore the original configuration, a single amber light that had blinked irregularly throughout the day suddenly turned solid. One conveyor restarted, then another. Across the operations floor, motion slowly returned as shipment routes recalculated themselves one after another without triggering a system reset. Conversations stopped in mid-sentence while employees watched thousands of status indicators change from warning colors to steady green. Naomi released a breath she did not realize she had been holding, but Derek never smiled. Instead, he stared at one small corner of the control display where a secondary alert had just appeared. The primary crisis was ending, yet one protected subsystem remained locked, and without restoring it, every shipment carrying temperature-sensitive medicine would still miss its delivery window. Derek quietly recognized the subsystem's identification code because it belonged to a section that only one person had ever taught him how to recover. Without waiting for applause, Derek walked directly toward the isolated subsystem that still refused to respond. The identification code on the display belonged to an older emergency refrigeration network installed long before the company's newest automation platform existed. Most of the younger engineers had never worked on it because the artificial intelligence normally handled every adjustment in the background. Derek quietly removed the access panel and smiled almost imperceptibly when he recognized the arrangement of the relays. Years earlier, his mentor had insisted that every technician learn how to restore this system by hand because medicine could not wait for perfect software. Some cargo has no second chance, the older man used to say. Derek reached into the cabinet and carefully reset 2 mechanical interlocks in a sequence that no computer manual listed anymore. Naomi watched every movement, realizing that the greatest advantage standing inside her building had never appeared in a leadership meeting or an executive report. It had been quietly tightening bolts, helping strangers, and noticing details everyone else ignored. The final relay clicked into place. For one long heartbeat, nothing changed. Then the temperature control network came alive, and shipment after shipment returned to active status across the operations wall. Hospital deliveries regained their estimated arrival times. Refrigerated trailers resumed loading. Emergency pharmacies confirmed their routes had been restored before critical deadlines expired. The operations center remained completely silent until one dispatcher began clapping softly. Another employee joined. Within seconds, the applause spread across the entire floor, not because a company had been saved, but because thousands of families waiting for medicine would never know how close those deliveries had come to disappearing. Derek lowered the panel and stepped back as though he had simply completed another ordinary repair. Naomi approached him without the distance she had maintained all day. "You could have walked away when your shift ended," she said quietly. Derek glanced toward the windows where the evening light had begun to fade. "I promised my son I would be home," he answered. "I also promised myself a long time ago that if I ever knew how to prevent people from losing something important, I would at least try." Naomi looked at the old personnel file still resting in her hands. "The engineer who wrote those notes," she asked gently. "He trained you, did not he?" Derek nodded once. "He taught me that the smallest clue usually belongs to the biggest truth." Naomi carefully closed the file instead of asking another question. She understood that some stories deserved respect before curiosity. Around them, executives who had dismissed him only an hour earlier quietly thanked him one after another, while the chief engineer admitted that every diagnostic model would need to be rewritten after what they had witnessed. Derek accepted every word with the same calm humility he had shown all day. As he picked up his worn toolbox to leave, his phone vibrated with a message from Caleb. It contained a single photograph of the old pocket watch resting on the kitchen table beside one tiny brass gear and one simple sentence. "Dad, I found the last missing piece. Did you find yours?" The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows of Caldwell Freight Systems as if the building itself had finally exhaled after a sleepless night. Freight trucks rolled out on schedule, hospital shipments reached their destinations, and the operations center that had nearly fallen silent now hummed with quiet confidence instead of panic. Naomi stood alone beside the auxiliary cabinet before the morning meeting began. The tiny amber indicator that had frightened everyone the day before now glowed steadily, without drawing a single glance from passing employees. She smiled at the irony. The smallest light in the building had revealed the biggest truth. Instead of placing the repaired sensor behind a locked panel where nobody would ever notice it again, she ordered a small engraved plaque to be mounted beside the cabinet. It did not mention profits, technology, or corporate success. It simply read, "Always verify what everyone else assumes." Later that afternoon, Naomi drove to Lincoln Elementary carrying nothing more than the old personnel file and the restored pocket watch Derek and Caleb had been repairing together. She found them sitting beneath a large oak tree outside the school playground. Caleb carefully pressed the final brass gear into place, wound the crown once, and listened as the tiny watch began ticking again with a steady rhythm. His face lit up with quiet pride. Derek looked at the moving hands before glancing toward his son. "You trusted your eyes this time," he said. Caleb smiled. "Because you taught me that small things carry more weight than people think." Naomi realized she had heard almost the same lesson before, but now it meant something entirely different. It was no longer about machinery. It was about people. She handed Derek the weathered personnel file. "It belongs with someone who understands why it mattered," she said. Derek accepted it carefully, opening the cover just enough to see his mentor's familiar handwriting one last time. Folded inside was a note he had never seen before. In faded pencil it read, "If you are reading this, then you finally trusted yourself more than the noise around you." Derek quietly closed the file, unable to hide a grateful smile. Naomi then offered him a senior engineering position, complete with a generous salary, but Derek surprised her once again. "Can I think about it until after dinner?" he asked. "I promised someone we would finish homework together tonight." Naomi laughed softly, not because the answer was unexpected anymore, but because she finally understood what had guided every decision he made. Success had never been the center of his life. Keeping his promises had. As father and son walked home side by side, Caleb slipped the restored pocket watch into his backpack beside the tiny inspection mirror he had forgotten to return. Derek noticed it, smiled, and shook his head with amused relief. The missing tool that had nearly changed everything had quietly found its way home, just as every forgotten piece of the story finally had. The watch continued ticking with calm precision as they disappeared down the sidewalk together, reminding anyone willing to notice that the smallest details often keep the most important moments moving forward. Thank you for watching until the end of the video.